The year was 1900. Mullen Cottage stood in a sloping field, 150 yards from Beacon Road and 6 miles north-east of the centre of Cardiff. The thatched house consisted of 2 rooms downstairs, a back kitchen and a front kitchen, also known as a sitting room, and 2 bedrooms upstairs. The ceilings were low, only about 6 feet high, and were held up by large oak beams. At some point in the past, a small storeroom had been built on to the back of the ground floor. The cottage could only be accessed from Beacon Road by traversing a small stream by way of a single plank bridge. The isolated property lay a mile or so south of Kevin Mabley Manor House, with the nearest village of St. Mellons being a little over a mile away in the opposite direction. On one side of the cottage was thick woodland, and the nearest farm, Nuardo Fach, owned by the Radcliffe family, was at the top of the next field. Mullen Cottage had been the home of 78-year-old Hannah Williams since 1858. After many decades of marriage, Hannah's husband John passed away in May 1899, and she now shared the cottage with her 48-year-old daughter, Elizabeth Williams. Hannah had several other children, including a son who had emigrated to America almost 2 decades previously, an adopted son, and an adopted daughter, who was biologically her granddaughter, with the latter living in Foxhole, Swansea. During his working life, Hannah's late husband John had worked as a gardener at nearby Kevin Mabley Estate. After retiring, he was provided with a pension of 8 shillings a week from his employers, the Chemies Tint family. Following his death, the pension was passed to Hannah. Hannah and Elizabeth also reared pigs and poultry and grew fruit to supplement their income. In all, they had about half an acre of orchard to tend. Elizabeth also took in laundry a couple of days a week. While she was not by any means rich, Hannah was also not on the breadline. She lived a simple but comfortable life. On Saturday, November 10th, 1900, both Hannah and her daughter Elizabeth were awake at 6:30 a.m. It was market day, when until recently the pair would travel weekly to Cardiff to sell the produce from their small holding. Although Hannah was in good health, due to her advance in years, she had recently begun to forego the trips to Cardiff. Instead, Elizabeth would go alone, usually doing the entire journey on foot. At 9 that morning, Elizabeth set off from the house to sell apples and eggs. She took her normal route into Cardiff, walking down Beacon Road until it met the main Newport to Cardiff Road, near the White Hart Inn. As Elizabeth left the house, her mother waved her farewell at the garden gate. At around 2 p.m. that day, a shepherd in the employ of a local farmer from Moyser Crocker Farm was out with his dog working in fields about 200 yards from Mullen Cottage. As he was going about his work, the dog suddenly pricked up its ears and became very restless. Then, in a flash, it bolted downfield in the direction of Mullen Cottage. The dog ran straight through the front gate of the garden and right up to the door. The door was shut, but the dog stayed there for some time, staring at it, barking furiously. After getting no response, the dog eventually turned heel and returned to the shepherd. While observing that the dog's behaviour was a little odd, the shepherd did not give it much thought and continued with his work. It was only later that the significance of this event would be understood. At around 4:30 p.m, Elizabeth Williams was on her way back from the market when she reached a point on Beacon Road, about a quarter of a mile from Mullen Cottage. Here she met a local man of around 30, named Maurice Evans, who was married to one of her cousins. He was in a hurry and running towards St. Mellons, the direction from which Elizabeth had just come. Abruptly, and without properly stopping, he told Elizabeth that he thought her mother, Hannah Williams, was dead. Hearing this shocking news, Elizabeth was overcome with a flood of emotion, and many questions filled her head. Before she could gather her thoughts, Maurice had hurried on past without further explanation. One report suggests that he may have said that her mother had some kind of a fit. It was just then that another man, Mr. Radcliffe, came out to Elizabeth. Mr. Radcliffe and his wife lived in Uanswered farm, the nearest dwelling to Mullen Cottage. The married couple were close friends of Hannah Williams. Mr. Radcliffe told Elizabeth that she should not go home, but instead should come to his house for a cup of tea. She agreed, but in order to do that, they had to walk past Mullen Cottage. Mr. Radcliffe insisted that Elizabeth did not go inside the house, though he offered no explanation of what might have happened there. On the way to Uanswered, the pair came across two other local men, Charles Rowlands and Tom Bodman, who also seemed to be aware that something had happened to Hannah Williams at the cottage. They would not elaborate on details, except to say there had been some kind of accident. It wasn't until 5:30 p.m. that Elizabeth was finally taken to Mullen Cottage. There, she found a police officer standing on the door and was confronted with the news that his 78-year-old mother, Hannah Williams, was indeed dead. More so, her death had not been an accident, but rather the result of violence. Hi, it's John here. I'm sorry there hasn't been an episode for so long. My summer was quite busy, and I've also had a painful frozen shoulder. This, coupled with, to be honest, mental exhaustion from doing the podcast for 4 years, meant I needed a break. I love doing the podcast, particularly the research and writing, but it is very time-consuming, especially the audio editing, as I do it all myself in my spare time, around family and work. I want to ensure the quality of the research and content is kept high, so with this in mind, for now at least, I'm going to do 1 episode a month. There may be occasions when I manage 2. As I spend so much time researching and reading for the podcast, I have very little time to promote it, so please share Persons Unknown with others, and if you enjoy it, leave a review on your podcast app. Thank you again for listening. Now back to this week's episode. From the scene at the cottage, it appeared Hannah had been darning a stocking in the front kitchen when she was attacked from behind and bludgeoned with her own coal hammer. The 18-inch tool, weighing approximately 2 pounds, was found on a heap of coal in the back kitchen. One surface of the hammer was flat, and the other pointed like a pick. Blood and matted hair was found on the flat surface, and blood was on the handle. Additionally, Hannah's neck had been slit with a razor or knife, probably the latter. It may have been a large clap knife of the folding variety used by sailors and labourers. A search of the property and its surroundings did not locate this weapon. It was theorised that the blade may have been thrown into the Rumney River, which flowed close by. Dr. Shiak from Lanishan arrived at the cottage and undertook a post-mortem on site. It was estimated that Hannah had been dead for 5 to 6 hours. This would put the time of death between 1 and 2 p.m, which lined up with when the shepherd's dog had run up to the house barking. There were wounds to the right and left side of the head, and a lacerated ear. Sources are unclear as to which one. Below the ear, the bone had been fractured. There were 2 wounds to the back of the head, and the right side of the skull was fractured. The fractures were a lot worse than the outward appearance of the wounds. The throat was cut just prior to, or just after death. One theory was that the massive head injuries had caused the body to convulse, and the killer, believing Hannah to be still alive, then slashed her throat. While a pool of blood was found by the body, it was surmised that if the heart had still been pumping, there would have been a lot more blood. Vomit with traces of bread was found on or near the body. Other than her injuries, Hannah was in good health. The body was not removed from Mullen Cottage, but was placed under a white sheet on a trestle table and put in a little storeroom just off the back of the cottage. Beside it, a small table displayed a cross made out of white and pink chrysanthemums. Written on a card next to it was the phrase, "She is not dead, but sleepeth." The motive for the murder was not obvious, but it was believed to be robbery. Hannah was known to take in a steady income and had a reputation for living frugally. Local rumours said she had amassed a tidy sum in savings. Estimates ranged from £30 to £200. The latter amounts to over £21,000 in today's money. The exact sum kept at the cottage was unknown, as Hannah kept that information private, even from her own daughter Elizabeth. It was evident that the upstairs of the cottage had been ransacked. A chest of drawers in the upstairs box room was pulled over, and the contents spilt out on the floor. Confusingly, a stash of money, totaling £30 in gold, tied in a brown paper package, was found close by and had not been taken. Had the killer not seen it, or were they disturbed in the act of committing the crime, forcing them to make a quick getaway? Perhaps the barking dog had frightened them away. Inquiries also revealed that Mrs. Radcliffe, from the nearby farm, had walked close by Mullen Cottage around the time the murder was believed to have been committed. Had the culprit been spooked by her presence? A smaller amount of money, £5 10 in gold, 3p in silver and 3p in copper, was found in a purse underneath the body. This had also seemingly been missed by the attacker, assuming their motive was in fact robbery. The only item missing from the house and believed to have been taken by the killer was an old watch with a brass case. This had belonged to Hannah's late husband, John. The common view amongst local people was that whoever had committed this crime must have had knowledge of Hannah and her finances, and this was why she had been targeted. This was a line of inquiry that the police were keen to probe. Mullen Cottage was very close to what was then the Glamorganshire and Monmouthshire border, so lots of constabularies were involved in the investigation. Some criticisms were levied at the local St Mellons police, as they were said to have been slow in informing Cardiff police about the murder, not doing so until 9:40 a.m. the following day. Newport police were not told until later on Sunday, and Glamorgan County police not until Monday. However, by Monday, November 12th, several high-ranking police officers from various forces gathered at the cottage. This included the Chief Constable of Monmouthshire Police, Mr. V. Bosanquet, Superintendent Porter from Risca, Superintendent Jones from Pontypool, and Inspector Lewis from Newport. So how and when did the crime first come to light? Hannah's body had been discovered in her cottage at around 3:30 p.m. on the afternoon of Saturday, November 10th, by Maurice Evans, the man Elizabeth had first encountered on the road as she returned from the market. As I have mentioned, he was a relative and was married to a niece of Hannah. Maurice's mother-in-law, Mrs. Lewis, had been married to Hannah's brother, though Mr. Lewis was deceased. Maurice gave an interview with a journalist from the South Wales Argus the day after the murder, in which he detailed his gruesome discovery. The journalist spoke to him when he was at Mullen Cottage, feeding the pigs. Maurice said that on Saturday morning he had no work, as he was ill. Through his wife, Hannah's niece, he arranged to go and see Hannah. He said that at 3 p.m. he left his cottage, which was around 1¼ miles away, and made his way on foot to Mullen Cottage, arriving at 3:30 p.m. He went to the back door and entered the property, before going up some steps into the front kitchen or sitting room. The door to the front kitchen was open, and he saw Hannah lying on the floor next to a pool of blood, with her head towards the fireplace. He then went to the front door and found it locked with a key on the inside, which he said was unusual. The curtain was partially drawn. He unlocked the door and looked out, but didn't see anyone. After recovering somewhat from the shock, he went back into the front kitchen and noticed that Hannah was lying on her right side with her skirt and clothing around her waist. I should say that this is the only reference I have come across mentioning the clothes being around the waist. Though they wouldn't have used the term sexual assault back then, there is no mention of any sexual element to the crime in any press reports or during later legal proceedings. Morris said Hannah's head was about a foot from the fender. One leg was straight and the other slightly drawn up and across the other leg. Her bonnet and glasses were on the floor a couple of feet away, near some blood. At this point, Morris said he stooped down to feel the cheek. It is later suggested this was to test for a pulse. Morris found the skin to be warm to the touch. He could clearly see that the head had been battered and the throat slit. Morris then said he went outside and saw two local men working in the fields, Charles Rowlands and Tom Bodman, and called them over. He had passed these two men some minutes earlier on the way to the cottage. He took them to Mullen Cottage and showed them the body of Hannah Williams. Charles Rowlands went to fetch Mr. Radcliffe in the next farm, and Morris went to St. Mellons police station. Here he informed P.C. Norris and P.C. Cook of what he had found. Tom Bodman stayed at the house. As Morris talked with the journalist from the South Wales Argus, it was said that his demeanour was not at all nervous or excitable. He came across as calm and quiet. He said he wanted to help all he could, but recognised he was in an unfortunate position as the person who discovered the body. He said he understood he would come under scrutiny by police, and indeed his clothes had already been taken to be examined. However, he was adamant that he could prove he did not leave his house that day until 3 p.m. If you remember, the murder was said to have taken place between 1 and 2 p.m. Most accounts favoured 2 p.m, so this fact would rule him out. Addressing the rumours that Hannah had been targeted because of her money, Morris said he had no motive, as he was not in need of money, and if he were, there were relatives he could go to who would help him. Morris was interviewed by police within 24 hours of the murder. Interviews were conducted at Mullen Cottage and the Radcliffe's farm. It was said he gave satisfactory answers to the questions posed to him. A couple of days after the murder, a curious story began circulating in newspapers. It was originally told to a press reporter by the driver of a bus between Cardiff and St. Mellons. This bus was of the horse-drawn variety, rather than the motorised kind. It was another 10 years or so before motorised buses were being used in Wales. The story was about a strange passenger who travelled on the bus on the day of the murder. The passenger was a man aged around 24 or 25, who had travelled from Cardiff to St. Mellons early on Saturday, November 10th. He made the return journey that evening, and the whole way he had regaled the driver with details about the murder of Hannah Williams. This was just hours after the body had been found, when not a word had yet been written about it in the press. The young man had a deep knowledge of the circumstances of the murder, and even claimed to have seen the body. At the time, the bus driver presumed the man must be a relative of the dead woman, but in hindsight thought he could have a more sinister connection to the crime. The bus driver worked the route regularly and had not seen this man before. He was a stranger to the St. Mellons area. The mysterious young man was described as a prosperous-looking artisan type who was well dressed. He alighted in Cardiff, but where he headed was not observed. When the police were asked by reporters what they made of this story, they claimed to have no knowledge of it. That quickly changed, and they set about trying to track the man. Detectives were able to find and identify the man, and he was able to give a satisfactory explanation for how he came by the information about the murder. The man had travelled to St. Mellons early on Saturday to visit friends. After spending the day in their company, he was standing outside the White Hart Inn, waiting for the evening bus to Cardiff, when Maurice Evans, the man who had discovered the body, hurried past on his way to the police station. After informing the police, Maurice then took the man back to Mullen Cottage with him and showed him the dead body. The young man was very disturbed by what he witnessed, and his constant talking to the bus driver about the subject was his way of processing the harrowing experience. It was ruled that the stranger had nothing to do with Hannah's death. Other early suspects, I use the term lightly, included, quote, some rough fellows from Cardiff seen picking blackberries and mushrooms in the area. However, Hannah's daughter, Elizabeth Williams, said she had not seen anyone like that near the cottage recently. Another individual was put forward by a local farmer from Michelstone, who said he saw a man of suspicious appearance walking on the road approaching Mullen Cottage at 6 a.m. on the day of the murder. The farmer passed the stranger when crossing the bridge that separates Glamorganshire from Monmouthshire, which was about 1.5 miles from the cottage. The man was wearing a vest, black coat and corduroy trousers. The farmer bade the man good morning, but the man did not reply until he had walked some distance further down the road. It's unclear if the identity of this man was ever discovered. From reading newspaper reports, it would appear that police investigated whether anyone would benefit financially from Hannah's death. Elizabeth Williams was quizzed by police about her mother's life insurance, and indeed she did have life insurance with the Prudential. That being said, the police did not pursue this angle as a potential motive. In terms of clues, the police had little to go on from the crime scene. Some footprints were found near the back door and were covered with a bucket to protect them from the elements. The prints were from a nailed shoe with a tipped heel, but were deemed to come from the boot of a boy, aged 12 or 13. These do not seem to have been proved to be connected to the crime. Hannah's funeral took place on Wednesday, November 14th. Dozens of friends and relatives were allowed to come to Mullen Cottage to see the body before it was taken in a polished elm coffin with brass fittings to Bethania Methodist Church for the service. According to census records, Hannah was a Welsh speaker. She had been a committed member of the Independent Welsh Chapel for 50 years, but this had closed down recently, and she had then started to attend Bethania Calvinistic Methodist Chapel. A crowd of around 400 came to stand in fields around the church, unable to get inside. Reverend James Whelan Davis of Caersalem Baptist Church took the service, and the hymn, Jesus Lover of My Soul, was sung, as well as the Welsh hymn, Bydd Myrdd Ori Feddoddau, There Will Be a Myriad of Wonders. The sincerity of Hannah's faith was lauded, and thanks was given for a life lived in quiet confidence in God. Hannah was well respected in the local community and held in high esteem by rich and poor alike. She had good relationships with neighbours and lived in peace with everyone. It made her murder all the more unfathomable. Hannah was laid to rest in the burial grounds of the recently closed down Independent Church. It was just a few hours after the funeral that police made an arrest. At 6:20 p.m, police arrived at Mullen Cottage and took into custody Maurice Evans, the very man who had discovered the body. He was questioned at St Mellons police station before being taken to Marshfield train station and from there to Usk jail. The following day, Maurice Evans was charged with wilful murder by James Goldsworthy, a Justice of the Peace for Monmouthshire and the Borough of Newport. On the train journey to the magistrate's court, Maurice was said to look defeated, but from the crowd who gathered at the train station, there was sympathy for his position. One woman was heard to exclaim, quote, "He can't be guilty." In one newspaper, Maurice Evans's age is given as 35, but another says he was 29. He was originally from Shropshire, and at one point had been in the army. He came to South Wales in search of better work opportunities. He had been living in the area for 7 years. Morris lived in one of 2 cottages which lay in the hollow of a meadow close to the Kevin Mabley mansion. He lived there with his wife and the couple's 2 children. I believe they were both girls. Morris also had at least one stepson. His mother-in-law, Mrs. Lewis, also lived with them. In the past, Morris had been employed at Rupera Castle, and by a farmer in Basleg, who spoke of him as a trusted employee. Just like Hannah Williams's late husband, Morris had also worked at Kevin Mabley Estate. More recently, he had been working 3 miles away at Pentwyn Colliery in Rydri as a surface labourer. There were 2 principal reasons for his arrest. The first was that Morris had lied about his whereabouts on the day of the murder. Originally, he had told police that he had been in all morning, as he was ill and unable to work, and had not left the house until around 3 p.m. At this time, he said he had wandered over to Mullen Cottage, as his wife had asked him to go over and check on Hannah. He mentioned this version of events in his interview with the South Wales Argus the day after the murder, and initially this timeline was backed up by his wife. However, 5 days or so after the murder, his wife claimed she had made a mistake and had got confused. She had been thinking about Friday, the day before the murder. It was on Friday that her husband had remained at the house all morning. She now said that Morris had left the house on Saturday, November 10th at 6 a.m, and she believed he was going to Pentwyn Colliery for work. Morris had returned home at 2:40 p.m, saying there had been no work available. Instead of working, Morris told his wife he had spent the morning with some chaps. Chaps meaning a group of men. Police inquiries showed that Morris had not been to Pentwyn Colliery on Saturday morning. No one saw him there, and indeed on Friday he had been explicitly told there would be no work for him until Monday. He could not account for his time on Saturday morning and early afternoon, other than to say he had been with some chaps. However, the identities of these men could not be firmly established. There were other inconsistencies with what Morris had told people. Apparently, when he first encountered Tom Bodman and Charles Rowlands, he failed to mention that he had touched the cheek of the dead woman. He had told them the sight of the dead body had made him go for help straight away. Another matter that raised concern involved Morris's knowledge of the ransacked state of the upstairs of the house. Initially, he had told police that he had not been upstairs. However, while at the home of P.C. Norris on the day after the murder, he mentioned to P.C. Norris's wife that the house had been ransacked. This contradiction drew suspicion. The second reason for the arrest was that blood was found on the clothing Morris had been wearing on Saturday morning. According to members of his family, he had left wearing a blue slop, a cheap loose-fitting garment worn by sailors and workmen, corduroy trousers, and a white scarf. I will elaborate on this evidence and the scientific analysis that accompanies it presently. Additionally, suspicion was raised regarding Morris because over the previous 6 months he had not visited Mullen Cottage, yet during the 2 weeks prior to the murder, he had gone there on multiple occasions. Over the course of the week before the murder, he had gone there 3 times. When initially questioned by police, he had failed to mention a Wednesday visit, only referring to visits on Monday and Thursday. Morris said he had visited on Monday and Thursday to collect some honey as his children were sick. On Wednesday, he had gone to ask Elizabeth Williams about picking up a pair of boots for him in Cardiff. His behaviour during 2 of the visits also raised suspicion, as when Hannah Williams's neighbour, Mrs. Radcliffe, called to the house to pick up some bread, Morris had hidden in another room, in an apparent attempt to conceal his presence from her. It was also understood that Morris had known that a sum of money was kept at Mullen Cottage, having been told this by Elizabeth Williams a week before the murder. Additionally, it was said that Morris was heard asking Hannah Williams how he could leave Mullen Cottage without passing other dwellings in the vicinity. Morris himself maintained his innocence. The newspapers actually published a letter that he sent to his wife whilst he was in jail on remand. He told her that his conscience was clear and he was as innocent as a newly born baby. He said he would look to God for comfort and support. While the police had made the arrest, the evidence they had was circumstantial at best, and so they busied themselves trying to collect something more substantial. In particular, they were desperate to find the weapon that was used to cut Hannah's throat, and the missing watch. If they could locate these items and connect them to Morris, it would massively shore up their case. In the search of Morris's home, they did come across a watch, but it was not the one missing from Mullen Cottage. The police also failed to find the bladed weapon used in the murder, although there is a story concerning a razor that was discovered in the garden of Mullen Cottage. In the days and weeks following the murder, people came in their droves from the towns of Cardiff, Newport, and the surrounding areas to Mullen Cottage in macabre fascination. On Sunday the 18th of November, a man from the town of Barry travelled to Mullen Cottage to see for himself what he had been reading about in the newspapers. As he was rummaging through the garden, looking for who knows what, he came across a white-handled razor in the hedge opposite the back door. An inspector working on the case investigated the razor and tried to determine if it had been used in the murder. He visited Morris's home and asked his wife if her husband's razor was accounted for. She said it was. He also asked Morris Evans's mother-in-law, Mrs. Lewis, if the razor belonged to her late husband. As far as I can tell, the razor did not belong to him, and it was dismissed as being relevant to the investigation. The fact that scores of nosy people kept turning up at the murder scene was a problem for police. On one occasion, 3 men from Tonopandi came to collect a souvenir from the garden. While attempting to cut a twig from the hedge, they noticed there was blood on it. The news travelled fast and caused much excitement, but it was soon found to belong to another souvenir hunter who had sliced his hand when attempting to take a cutting. Despite a witness to this event assuring people the blood did not belong to Hannah Williams, within minutes people were trying to take branches, believing it to be the victim's blood. The trial of Morris Evans took place at Monmouth Assizes, held in the Town Hall on February 20th, 1901. The weather was cold and crisp as a huge crowd of people turned up to see the proceedings. Only about 1/10 of those who came managed to fit inside the court building. The jury was made up of 12 people, all men, aged 30 to 70. They were all said to be, quote, country people, which meant rural folk from Monmouthshire. Proceedings were presided over by Justice Wright, who entered the court to a fanfare, as was the custom in those days. The prosecution barristers were A.T. Lawrence and St. John Micklethorpe. The defence counsel were R.H. Amphlett and F.W. Sherwood of Harold and Lloyd Chambers. Morris was transported to the court from Usk Jail by train. His hair was cut short and he sported a trimmed moustache. Accounts suggest he looked well, and indeed Morris later stated that the prison wardens had taken good care of him and he had put on 7 or 8 pounds during his time on remand. The prosecution gave the details of Morris Evans's numerous visits to Mullen Cottage and the fact he had tried to conceal himself from Mrs. Radcliffe on 2 occasions. They also went through his discrepancies concerning his whereabouts on Saturday morning and the fact his version of events had changed. I've already gone over these details, but to summarise, he first said he had been in all morning and then said he had gone to work but had been unable to find any, so he spent the morning with some men. Mrs. Lewis, Morris's mother-in-law, testified he had awoke at 5 a.m. on Saturday and had left the house at 6 a.m. He was wearing his blue slop, corduroy trousers and white scarf. He returned at 2:30 or 2:40 p.m. and left again to go to Hannah Williams's cottage. He washed himself and changed his clothes before leaving. It is detailed elsewhere that he changed into a dark suit. The chaps, or men that he had been with that morning, were never identified. Maurice Evans couldn't give an explanation for any of the discrepancies I have mentioned. The prosecution said they could not say for sure where the defendant was during this time, but intimated they believed he was hiding in the woods by Melon Cottage, though of course they had no proof of this. A large proportion of the prosecution argument was given over to the scientific evidence, namely the blood found on the defendant's clothing. Specifically, the blue slop was discovered to have blood on it. This had been the coat Maurice's own family had said he was wearing when he left early on the morning of November 10th. It was evident there had been a rigorous effort to scrub the blood out from the fabric of the slop. Maurice claimed he had had a nosebleed some 3 weeks prior and had also cut his finger. He said a fellow worker saw him do this, but when this worker was called to the stand to testify, he said he saw nothing of the kind. The slop was also found to have vomit on it, which was starchy in nature, probably containing bread. Evidence was heard that the vomit pattern showed it could not have come from the wearer of the slop. The court heard from 2 analysts. The first, G.R. Thompson from Monmouthshire County Council, stated there had been a 6-week delay in receiving the blue slop from the police, which was not ideal. He went on to say there was blood on the slop, but could not confirm whether it was animal or human. It was actually in 1900, the same year Hannah Williams was killed, that a serum was first developed that would eventually allow analysts to make this distinction. The blood on the coat could belong to a rabbit that Maurice had caught and killed. In the opinion of G.R. Thompson, the vomit on the clothing could not be that of a child unless the child had a cut inside the mouth when they vomited. I think the inference is that the defence had said it could belong to one of the defendant's children, as they had been ill in the week before the murder. G.R. Thompson went on to say the microscopic chemical examination left him in no doubt as to the origin of the vomit. Justice Wright took this to mean that the vomit was human, and asked G.R. Thompson if he could say this with certainty, and he replied, "I think I can." However, a different analyst, Frederick William Stoddart, then gave evidence and said he could not determine if the vomit was human or animal. Other suspects were briefly brought up by the prosecution and dismissed. 2 woodcutters who had lodged at Melon Cottage the previous year were put forward as suspects by some local people. The prosecution were able to find these men, and the court heard from them. The 2 men were able to prove that they were nowhere near St. Mellons when the murder happened. While the prosecution said it was impossible to exhaust all other possibilities, in their mind there wasn't anyone else who could have committed the crime, other than the defendant. I have also read about a gardener from Malpas near Newport, who gave the names of 2 men as potential suspects. I believe these could be the 2 men I have just mentioned. It's difficult to fathom from reports. Justice Wright seemed sceptical about this information and asked the police if the gardener who provided it was respectable. A police officer replied that he was respectable, but, quote, eccentric. If these 2 men were not the lodgers, they were also dismissed as suspects. The defence centred their argument on the lack of direct evidence against Maurice Evans. They made the point that a person cannot be convicted on suspicion alone. They argued that the blood on Maurice's slop could have come from a rabbit that he had killed against a tree. Like many men, Maurice hunted regularly. There was also no motive for Maurice to murder Hannah Williams. He was a man of good character, and the court heard from his mother-in-law, Mrs. Lewis, how kind he was to his children and wife. Hannah's own daughter, Elizabeth, said in her testimony that in the past, Maurice had been kind to her mother and had supported them after Hannah's husband, John's passing. The defence stressed that despite being questioned by 12 separate police officers, Maurice had not cracked. In their opinion, this was not something a guilty man would be able to do. I mentioned earlier that a razor was found in the garden of Mullen Cottage. No blood was found on the blade, and therefore Justice Wright was not convinced of its importance. The jury was basically told to disregard it. One important thing to note is that during the trial, Justice Wright criticised the police as they apparently gave the witnesses written copies of their own statements they had previously given when questioned. This was very unusual. Written statements would normally only be provided to witnesses on request. It would seem that the police wanted to ensure that the witnesses remembered all the details and left nothing out. In his summing up for the jury, Justice Wright said there was no direct evidence or motive against Maurice Evans. He said the accused had been friendly with Hannah Williams. He did stress to members of the jury that while they may not fully understand the scientific evidence, they needed to look at it. While the analysts were not in agreement regarding whether the vomit was human, the judge made the point that only humans eat bread. He posed the question, why did Maurice Evans discard his clothing after returning to his cottage on Saturday afternoon? And why scrub the stains of blood so vigorously if it was merely his own blood from a nosebleed or from a rabbit he had hunted? If the blood had been on there for up to 3 weeks, why had he paid little attention to it before that day? The judge also asked the jury to consider where were the chaps, or men, that Maurice had claimed to be with during that morning. And finally, he mentioned the fact the defendant had told PC Norris's wife that he had been upstairs and the house had been ransacked, yet failed to mention this to Tom Bodman, the first person he saw after finding the body. The jury would need to consider all these questions, but if unsure, they had to give the benefit of the doubt to the defendant. The summing up by Justice Wright took 30 minutes. The jury retired to consider their verdict at 8:40 p.m. During the wait, the defendant seemed relaxed. He was seen cracking jokes with the prison guards and his solicitors. After 24 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned at 4 minutes past 9 o'clock. They gave a verdict of not guilty. A large crowd gathered around the town hall entrance and cheered loudly when Maurice Evans appeared. It seems the verdict was met favourably by a significant proportion of the public. Maurice tried to make it over to the King's Head pub, but the bustling crowd was so dense it was impossible for him to get there. Eventually the crowd dispersed a little, and he went to the King's Head, where he gave an interview to local press and thanked them for the just and fair way he had been treated in their reporting of events. He told them that when he first listened to the judge summing up, he thought it was favourable, but then began to doubt during the latter part of his speech. Despite this, he had no fear and felt it would turn out well for him. That is where the story ends. Hannah Williams's killer was never found, and 125 years later, all those involved in the case and their children have long since passed. The Chemise Tint family, who owned Mullen Cottage, decided to tear it down shortly after the murder. The area where it once stood now lies opposite Cardiff Golf Centre and is just a stone's throw from the M4 motorway. In preparation for this podcast episode, I visited the location to remember Hannah and reflect on the tragic events from all those years ago.